Here we are for another round of the 70s versus the 90s, and it's an assassin showdown when I put Fred Zinnemann's The Day of the Jackal against Michael Caton-Jones's The Jackal. And this one, I mean, there's not really much to dive into with plot because they're very similar movies, but also very different. The Day of the Jackal, directed by Fred Zinnemann, is based off of the best-selling novel by Frederick Forsyth. And I haven't read the novel, so this isn't going to be a comparison of who did the book better. But you can also tell with The Jackal, Universal clearly owned the property to that book still, and they obviously wanted to keep the rights, but didn't want to like do a straight remake of the Day of the Jackal, because what the Day of the Jackal is based around is an assassination attempt on president of France at the time, Charles de Gaulle, in the early '60s, and because this organization was pissed off that he had liberated Algeria and shit. So they wanted him dead, and they hired this assassin known as the Jackal, played by Edward Fox. And Edward Fox is really brilliant in the film. He's very cold and calculated, and kind of looks a bit poncy, but that's to come with Englishmen sometimes, especially blonde-haired ones. And the one thing that gets me about the Day of the Jackal, though, it's a very meticulous film, which of course Fred Zinnemann was a very meticulous filmmaker. But in my opinion, Fred Zinnemann peaked in the '50s, with films like High Noon and From Here to Eternity. That's why people call him a great filmmaker. And of course, I won all the Oscars for A Man for All Seasons. But I still say he peaked in the '50s. This was like the first of his last three films, and you can tell like there's a certain energy to it. But the one thing that irks me the most about The Day of the Jackal is it's a movie that takes place in France, and mostly like there's maybe a third of the cast that is actual French actors. The rest of them all seem like British, and even the French actors sound like they're fucking just British actors and shit. That kind of shit irks me. That's my biggest pet peeve with movies. If you're not gonna cast the actual like nationality of the characters, then at least get somebody that is willing to or can pull off the accent, which that's where a point goes for the Jackal, because that one is basically kind of an updated version of this. Like I said, you can tell the Universal still owned the property to this story, and they didn't want to do a straight remake of the Day of the Jackal because, one, in what I think is that possibly it wasn't relevant anymore. In the early '70s, this story was still pretty relevant at a time where like, French cinema was a big deal, and most not just American cinema, but like cinema was more international than anything else. I mean, to a certain extent, it still was in the '90s, but American audiences didn't give as much of a fuck about international shit, mainly because international cinema had kind of gone down the shitter. It did have a bit of a revitalization in the '90s, thanks to motherfuckers like Miramax and October Films that really amped up the international market. And you also had a lot of vibrant filmmakers come out of that time. But in the Jackal, it takes place in Russia, where the FBI is like fucking with all the organized crime there and shit. Led by the FBI is led by Sidney Poitier, and they get into a bit of shit, and they fucking shoot one of like the higher up in the fucking Russian mob and shit. So they decide, well, we're gonna take out the FBI director. So they hire the Jackal, which is played by Bruce Willis, who honestly, he's so fucking cold in this movie. He makes Edward Fox look like an even bigger Ponce, basically. And like I said, dude, this probably maybe not the best Bruce Willis performance, but it's up there because, man, he is so cold, just straight up psycho, fucking professional. Like he fucking kills it in this one. And of course, like they don't know how to catch this motherfucker, so they know of one person that might know who he is, and that's an IRA soldier played by Richard Gere, who's in an American prison. And the thing about it is, like, Richard Gere fucking nails that Irish accent. Like, Richard Gere is one of the more like underrated actors. He kind of gets that fucking facade of like just a pretty boy actor, but dude's got some acting chops. And he definitely shows it here. And of course, even Diane Verona, I believe, who was also in Michael Mann's Heat and the substitute, and she's absolutely nailing the Russian accent. You know, I forget her, Koslova or whatever her name was in the film. That's they fucking hit the accents perfect, because if they actually have Russians playing Russians, and if they're not, they're nailing the accent. Same thing with Richard Gere playing an Irishman. You would think that he would suck ass doing that accent, but he, like I said, he fucking nails that shit. And but there are like 4 or 5 moments that seem like probably were in Frederick Forsyth's book, but they also appear in The Day of the Jackal as well. There's a lot of similar scenes, like that ending for one, where they're burying the Jackal character. Although the ending of The Day of the Jackal just kind of like, you know, what's cool about the Jackal, and what in my opinion makes it more entertaining than The Day of the Jackal, is that there's a lot more conflict involved. Like, honestly, the way The Day of the Jackal is set up, it's more like a fucking police procedural than anything else. You get a little narrator that explains a bunch of shit, but then again, you get a narrator, then you don't get the narrator that explains a lot of shit. So, you know, they've got a lot of the characters that come in and out. They got the villain from Moonraker in this shit. He's the one that kind of cracks everything. This is a similar scene that's like where he taps the phone to figure out who the rat is. He's like, how did you know whose phone to tap? I didn't. I just tapped everybody's. Sidney Poitier says that same fucking line in The Jackal. And so that's 2 similar scenes right there. And of course, that sequence where the dude tries to like fucking strong arm Edward Fox into like blackmailing him into some more money and shit. We see that scene intermixed with 2 different scenes in The Jackal, because he gets Bruce Willis's character approaches Jack Black to get him to build some fucking thing for the gun that he's gonna use and shit, and then Homeboy wants to try to blackmail him. So they intermix like 2 things. That's what makes The Jackal so great. It's like they take like all the best parts of The Day of the Jackal, and then they expound upon them. You know, so I don't know if I would technically call The Jackal a remake of The Day of the Jackal. I just look at it as more or less, it's like we have this property, but we don't want to like make the same old shit, you know. So I guess it is technically a remake, you know, I don't want to use the term reboot because it's a dumb fucking term, but like they add more drama in there too, because you got, you know, apparently the Jackal had shot Richard Gere's woman at the time, Isabella, who's now like, she's got, you know, a husband and kids, and of course she was pregnant at the time that she got shot, and they lost the kids. So there's that drama. So it's very personal, you know. And there's that whole distinction of the fire and ice comparison, you know, because like Richard Gere's character was very fiery and passionate about a cause, whereas like Bruce Willis's character, he's just cold and calculating. He's in it for the money, you know. It's all about the job type thing. And so seeing those 2 face off, the showdown at the end is a lot more climactic than The Day of the Jackal. You know, at the end, of course, the villain from Moonraker ends up fucking shooting Edward Fox, and then, you know, it just kind of ends, you know, very cold and calculating, like I said. Now, the thing about it is director, like Michael Caton-Jones, is kind of a journeyman director. You know, he mostly did like dramas and a few action movies and stuff, but nothing like, didn't really have like the range of Fred Zinnemann, but somehow has more of a passion through the ages and stuff. So I don't know. This round clearly has to go to The Jackal, because one, it's just a far more entertaining movie. Like the Day of the Jackal runs a little too long. You know, they probably could have tightened it up. You know, there's a lot of stuff that, you know, that so much. It is very meticulous. It's not a poorly made movie. I just think it was a little drawn out. You know. And you could argue that maybe the attention span was a little better in the 70s. You know, maybe people didn't have a whole lot of shit to do, so they won't waste 2.5 hours at a movie. But I mean, The Jackal runs just a little over 2 hours, and it's a lot tighter, and it runs a lot smoother. You know, there's not a lot of there's not too many moving parts, you know, and it's a lot more fucking intense, you know. So that's another thing. Like, you really feel that shit. Like I said, Bruce Willis's performance is far better than Edward Fox, and then the whole acting in The Jackal is better than The Day of the Jackal. One, because, you know, motherfuckers are actually doing the accent, and then 2, you actually give a fuck. Like most of the actors, it were just, random ass British or French actors that nobody really cared about. You had the leader of the resistance that gets shot at the beginning of the Day of the Jackal. He's the husband from Belle de Jour, and he's like, no French gun no French soldier will raise their gun to me, and then they fucking do. It's kind of, there are a few moments in the Day of the Jackal that are really good, but on the whole, it just doesn't have that intensity that the Jackal does. That's one thing about it. That the thrillers in the '90s were a lot better. I don't know if it was more because they might have been sexier or sleeker, but it just, I can't really pinpoint why it's just bad. It just feels more like a real ass movie. It's something that if you put on, you want to keep watching. The Day of the Jackal, I feel like would work better as a fucking like documentary or maybe even a series. I hate to say that shit too, but a 2.5 hour movie is just fucking a lot of fucking information thrown at you and stuff, and it's just fucking moves really fucking slow, which could prove the argument like Fred Zinnemann late in his career didn't really know how to make a fast-paced movie like something like High Noon or From Here to Eternity that he's best known for. So anybody keeping score, that's 84 to 67. 70s are only up by 17 now. I mean, the 90s, man, they get them 1-2 punches in. They're shrinking that lead, but they still got a long way to go before they can overtake the 70s again. But like I said, you can't discount the 90s, even though my money is still on the 70s. They had little gems like this that, maybe you might discount them because you see them play on a loop on fucking TNT or some shit, But 84 to 67, 70s are only up by 17 now. We'll see if the 90s can continue. Now they're on a 2-film streak. See if they can continue to whoop that ass. But if I've said anything wrong, anything you disagree with, feel free to eviscerate me in the comments. This is just one asshole's opinion on a long, self-indulgent journey to figure out which decade was better for movies, the 70s or the 90s. So better watch out, because you never know who's coming for you.